Good morning. I want to begin today by acknowledging something that most economic analysts, most policy professionals, and most serious observers of international trade have known for a very long time. And that is this: the relationship between the United States and Canada is not simply a bilateral trade arrangement between two neighboring countries. It is, in the most precise and technical sense of the word, an economic architecture. It is a structure that was deliberately designed, carefully negotiated, and painstakingly maintained over the course of decades by administrations of both parties, by finance ministers and treasury secretaries on both sides of the border, by central bankers, by trade lawyers, by agricultural economists, and by energy sector professionals who understood with great clarity that the interdependence between our two nations was not a vulnerability. It was a strategic asset of the highest order. So, when I sit before you today and address the events of the past 72 hours, events that have sent ripple effects through energy futures markets, through currency trading desks, through the bond markets, and through the offices of chief financial officers at some of America's largest industrial corporations, I want to be very clear that what we are witnessing is not a momentary diplomatic friction. What we are witnessing is the beginning of a structural realignment in North American energy economics, and the consequences of that realignment will be felt not just in the next quarterly earnings report, but in the foundational architecture of American energy security for years and potentially decades to come. Let me provide the necessary context, because context is everything in economic analysis, and without it, we risk misinterpreting what is happening, and more dangerously, we risk misunderstanding what must be done in response. The events that precipitated this moment began not in a boardroom, not in a treasury department, and not in a central bank. They began in a public setting during an exchange that was broadcast to the world, in which the President of the United States referred to the sitting Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, a man who served as Governor of the Bank of Canada, who then served as Governor of the Bank of England during one of the most consequential periods of financial instability in modern British history, and who is now the elected leader of one of America's most critical economic partners, as simply Governor. The use of that title in that context was not an accident of memory. It was a signal. And Prime Minister Carney, who spent the better part of 2 decades reading signals in financial markets far more complex and far more consequential than a political press conference, understood it immediately for what it was. Now, I want to be careful here, because my role is not to adjudicate matters of diplomatic protocol or political intention. My role, the role I have occupied at the Federal Reserve, at the Council of Economic Advisors, and at the Treasury Department, is to analyze economic cause and effect with precision and honesty, regardless of which direction that analysis points. And the honest analysis here is deeply concerning, not because of what was said in that exchange, but because of what Canada did in response, and what that response reveals about the shifting calculus of our northern neighbors' long-term economic strategy. Within hours of that public exchange, Prime Minister Carney's government announced the suspension and redirection of approximately $30 billion in U.S.-bound energy deals. Let me repeat that figure clearly so that its magnitude is not lost in the noise of political commentary. $30 billion. That is not a rounding error. That is not a symbolic gesture designed for domestic political consumption, although it certainly carries domestic political weight in Canada. That is a material, quantifiable, and immediately consequential withdrawal of energy supply commitments that American utilities, American manufacturers, American refiners, and American households were, to varying degrees, depending upon. And when I use the word depending upon, I am not speaking loosely. I am speaking in the precise language of supply chain economics, energy infrastructure planning, and long-term capital allocation. To understand why this matters so profoundly, we need to understand the nature of the US-Canada energy relationship in its full dimension. Canada is not merely a trading partner in the energy sector. Canada is, by virtually every meaningful metric, the single most important source of foreign energy for the United States. In the most recent full-year data available, Canada supplied approximately 60% of all U.S. crude oil imports. It supplied the majority of U.S. natural gas imports. It supplied significant volumes of hydroelectric power to states across the northern tier of the country, from New England through the Great Lakes region and into the Pacific Northwest. These are not discretionary inputs. These are foundational energy flows that underpin American industrial production, American home heating, American electricity generation, and increasingly, American clean energy transition planning. When $30 billion of those energy commitments are redirected, not canceled outright, but redirected, which in some ways is more strategically significant than a simple cancellation, the immediate effects are felt across multiple layers of the American economy simultaneously. The first layer is price. When supply commitments are withdrawn or redirected, the immediate market response is upward pressure on price. We have already seen this in the natural gas futures markets, where front-month contracts moved sharply higher in the trading sessions following the announcement. We have seen it in certain regional electricity markets, particularly in New England, where Canadian hydroelectric imports play a disproportionately large role in maintaining grid stability and price competitiveness. And we are beginning to see early indications of it in certain refined petroleum product markets, where the redirection of Canadian crude supply is creating localized tightening in refinery input availability. The second layer is investment. Energy infrastructure is not built on short-term contracts. Pipelines, processing facilities, storage terminals, transmission lines. These are assets with 30, 40, 50-year economic lives, and they are financed on the basis of long-term supply commitments. When those commitments are called into question, not just the $30 billion announced this week, but the broader question of whether the US-Canada energy relationship is as stable and as reliable as it has historically been assumed to be, the risk premium embedded in future energy infrastructure investment in the United States increases. That means higher financing costs. It means longer permitting timelines as investors demand greater certainty before committing capital. It means, in the medium term, a potential slowdown in the expansion of American energy infrastructure at precisely the moment when we need that infrastructure to support both our clean energy transition and our broader economic competitiveness. The third layer, and this is the one that I want to spend considerable time on as we move through this analysis, is the strategic layer. Because what Prime Minister Carney did was not simply redirect $30 billion of energy trade. What he did was demonstrate with remarkable clarity and with the credibility of a former central banker who understands better than almost anyone alive the relationship between economic leverage and geopolitical positioning, that Canada has alternatives. And the existence of those alternatives, the Asian LNG terminals, the European energy partnerships, the infrastructure investments that Canada has been quietly making over the past several years, precisely to reduce its own dependence on U.S. market access, fundamentally changes the negotiating geometry of the U.S.-Canada economic relationship in ways that will outlast any single administration and any single diplomatic incident. I have spent my career studying economic leverage. I have studied it in the context of monetary policy, where the Federal Reserve's credibility is itself a form of leverage over inflation expectations. I have studied it in the context of fiscal policy, where the structure of the federal balance sheet determines America's capacity to respond to economic shocks. And I have studied it extensively in the context of international economic relations, where the distribution of economic dependencies between nations determines, more than any other single factor, the ultimate outcomes of trade disputes, currency conflicts, and geopolitical competitions. And what I can tell you, with the full weight of that experience behind me, is that a trading partner who has demonstrated both the will and the capacity to redirect $30 billion of energy commitments in response to a diplomatic slight is a trading partner who has fundamentally altered the terms of the relationship. The question is not whether this happened. The question is what it means, what it costs, and what, if anything, can be done to restore the stability that both economies require. We will address each of those questions in the analysis that follows. But I want to close this opening section with a broader observation that I believe is essential to understanding the full significance of this moment. The United States has, for the better part of a generation, operated with a degree of confidence, some would say complacency, about the reliability of our northern economic relationships. We have assumed that Canada, by virtue of geography, by virtue of cultural affinity, by virtue of the deep integration of our supply chains, and by virtue of the institutional frameworks of NAFTA and its successor agreement, the USMCA, would always be available to us on terms that we largely defined. That assumption is now being tested, and the test is not being administered by an adversary. It is being administered by an ally, a sophisticated, economically capable, diplomatically experienced ally who has concluded, at least provisionally, that the terms of the relationship as currently constituted are no longer acceptable. That is a profoundly important development, and it deserves the most serious and rigorous economic analysis that we can bring to bear upon it. Let me turn now to the specific economic mechanics of what a $30 billion energy redirection means in practice, because I think there is a tendency in public discourse to treat large numbers as abstractions, as figures that exist in press releases and policy documents, but whose real-world consequences remain somehow distant and theoretical. I want to correct that tendency directly and deliberately, because the consequences of what Canada announced this week are neither distant nor theoretical. They are immediate, they are measurable, and they are already beginning to manifest in ways that any serious economic observer should find deeply instructive. To begin with the most fundamental point, energy is not a discretionary commodity. It is not a luxury good whose consumption can be deferred when prices rise or supply tightens. Energy is the foundational input of every sector of the modern economy. It heats homes and powers factories. It fuels the transportation networks that move goods from producers to consumers. It powers the data centers that underpin the digital economy. It is embedded in the cost structure of virtually every product that American businesses produce and every service that American workers deliver. When the supply of energy is disrupted, even partially, even temporarily, even in ways that are ultimately manageable, the effects propagate through the economy with a speed and a breadth that few other supply shocks can match. This is why energy security has been, without exception, a cornerstone of American economic and national security policy for more than half a century. And it is why the redirection of $30 billion in Canadian energy commitments is not simply a trade story. It is an economic security story of the first order. Now, let me be precise about what we know and what we do not yet know about the specific composition of these redirected commitments. The announcement from the Canadian government was deliberately broad in its initial framing. A strategic choice, I would note, that reflects considerable sophistication about how to maximize negotiating leverage while preserving optionality. What we know is that the redirections involve a combination of natural gas supply agreements, crude oil pipeline commitments, and hydroelectric power purchase arrangements. What we do not yet know with precision is the timeline for implementation, the specific counterparties to whom these commitments are being redirected, and the degree to which existing long-term contracts versus more flexible short-term arrangements are implicated. These distinctions matter enormously for assessing both the immediate market impact and the longer-term structural consequences. On the natural gas side, the implications are particularly significant for the northeastern United States. New England is, by the peculiar geography of its pipeline infrastructure, one of the most energy-isolated regions in the continental United States. Despite sitting adjacent to the Marcellus and Utica shale formations, two of the most productive natural gas deposits in the world, New England lacks the pipeline capacity to import sufficient quantities of domestically produced natural gas to meet its winter heating and power generation needs. It has historically filled that gap through a combination of Canadian natural gas imports, liquefied natural gas imports from international sources, and, critically, Canadian hydroelectric power, which has provided both reliable baseload capacity and the flexibility to reduce natural gas consumption during periods of peak demand. If Canadian energy commitments to this region are materially reduced, the consequences for New England electricity and heating costs could be severe, particularly during the winter months when demand is highest and supply alternatives are most constrained. I want to draw on a specific historical parallel here because I think it illuminates the current situation with considerable clarity. During the winter of 2013 and 2014, a period that energy economists refer to as the polar vortex event, a sudden and severe cold snap across the northeastern and midwestern United States created a spike in natural gas demand that overwhelmed available supply and pipeline capacity. Spot natural gas prices in certain northeastern markets rose to levels that were, by any historical standard, extraordinary, in some cases exceeding $100 per million British thermal units at a time when the national benchmark price was closer to $4 or $5. Electricity prices spiked correspondingly. Industrial facilities curtailed production. Utilities burned through emergency reserves. The economic cost of that single weather event, measured in terms of elevated energy prices alone, ran into the billions of dollars across the affected region. Now, I am not suggesting that the current situation will necessarily produce outcomes of that severity. The circumstances are different in important ways, and there are supply alternatives and demand management tools available today that were not fully developed in 2013. But the polar vortex episode illustrates a fundamental truth about energy markets that is directly relevant to the current moment. In a system with limited supply flexibility and high demand sensitivity, even a partial withdrawal of supply can produce price responses that are disproportionately large relative to the volume of supply actually removed. This is the phenomenon that economists call price elasticity of demand in inelastic markets, and the northeastern U.S. energy market is, by virtue of its infrastructure constraints, one of the most inelastic energy markets in the developed world. The redirection of Canadian energy commitments into this market context is not a minor perturbation. It is a significant supply shock being delivered into a system with limited capacity to absorb it without material price consequences. Moving beyond the immediate regional implications, I want to address the broader macroeconomic consequences of sustained energy price increases, because this is where the story of a bilateral diplomatic incident connects to the larger narrative of American economic performance and Federal Reserve monetary policy. The relationship between energy prices and inflation is one of the most well-documented and consequential relationships in all of macroeconomics. Energy costs are a direct component of the consumer price index, and they are also an indirect driver of inflation across virtually every other category of goods and services, because energy is an input cost in the production and distribution of almost everything that households and businesses buy. The Federal Reserve spent the better part of 2022 and 2023 engaged in the most aggressive monetary policy tightening cycle in 4 decades, raising the federal funds rate from near zero to over 5% in an effort to bring inflation back to the 2% target after the supply chain disruptions and demand surges of the post-pandemic period pushed consumer prices to their highest levels in 40 years. That effort was largely successful, and by the time I left the Treasury Department, inflation had declined substantially from its peak, though the path back to target remained incomplete and the risks of reacceleration remained present. One of the most important factors in the inflation dynamics of that period was energy prices, specifically the surge in energy prices following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which added significantly to headline inflation and complicated the Federal Reserve's task of achieving a soft landing for the economy. The reason I raise this history is not to relitigate past policy decisions, but to make a point that is directly relevant to the current moment. Energy price increases are among the most potent and most difficult to manage sources of inflationary pressure in the modern economy. They affect consumers directly through higher gasoline, heating, and electricity costs. They affect producers indirectly through higher input costs that are eventually passed through to consumer prices. and they affect monetary policy through the difficult question of whether central banks should look through energy-driven inflation as a temporary supply shock or respond to it as a signal of broader price instability. These are not hypothetical concerns. They are the precise questions that policymakers at the Federal Reserve and at the Treasury Department will be forced to confront if Canadian energy redirection produces sustained upward pressure on American energy prices. There is a further dimension to this that I want to address with particular care because it touches on an aspect of economic policy that is often underappreciated in public discourse, which is the question of what I would call second order confidence effects. Markets are not simply mechanical systems that respond to changes in supply and demand in a linear and predictable fashion. They are also, in a profound sense, confidence systems. Systems whose behavior is shaped by the expectations and beliefs of the participants within them. When a significant and credible economic actor, and Canada, with its trillion-dollar economy, its AAA credit rating, its sophisticated financial markets, and its leadership by a former central banker of global stature, is unquestionably a significant and credible economic actor. When such an actor takes a dramatic and public step to redirect $30 billion of economic activity away from the United States, it sends a signal to every other economic actor in the world about the reliability and predictability of the United States as an economic partner. That signal matters. It matters to sovereign wealth funds evaluating the risk premium on U.S. assets. It matters to multinational corporations making supply chain investment decisions. It matters to foreign central banks managing their reserve portfolios. And it matters, perhaps most consequentially of all, to the network of allied and partner nations whose economic relationships with the United States are built on the assumption that American commitments, whether embodied in trade agreements, security guarantees, or diplomatic norms, are durable and reliable. When that assumption is called into question, the confidence effects can be both broad and persistent, extending well beyond the specific bilateral relationship in which the disruption originated. This is not alarmism. This is the straightforward application of well-established principles of international economic credibility to the current situation. The United States has benefited enormously over many decades from its reputation as the anchor of the global economic order, a reputation that is reflected in the dollar's status as the world's primary reserve currency, in the depth and liquidity of U.S. financial markets, and in the willingness of nations around the world to hold their savings in U.S. Treasury securities, even at yields that in many periods have been lower than those available on alternative assets. That reputation is not a natural endowment. It is an earned asset built through consistent and principled engagement with the international economic system over many decades. And like all earned assets, it can be depleted through careless or inconsistent behavior. The events of this week represent, in my assessment, a meaningful withdrawal from that reputational account. And the long-term cost of such withdrawals is invariably higher than it appears in the immediate term.